The judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, silencing any murmurs before they even began. Judge Alexander Hayes adjusted his glasses with surgical precision, flipping through the papers in front of him with an implacable gaze. He was a man known for his coldness, his impatience with inexperienced lawyers, and his complete intolerance of any attempt to question his authority. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers, journalists, and onlookers crowded into the benches, eager to watch another day of trials under Judge Hayes's feared supervision. He looked up, his deep, commanding voice cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. Next case. The heavy courtroom door opened slowly. The noise echoed through the room, drawing everyone's attention, but no one was prepared for what was to come next. A girl walked in. She looked no older than 16. Her light brown hair was pulled back, in a casual bun, and the blazer she wore was slightly too big for her slender frame. In her hands was a worn leather briefcase. A buzz filled the room. A lawyer whispered to his colleague, "Is this child lost?" But the girl didn't hesitate. Her gaze was steady, and her posture was that of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She walked to the center of the courtroom, stopped before the judge, and in a confident, unwavering tone of voice declared, "Good morning, Your Honor. I am here to represent the defendant, Lucas Monroe." The courtroom erupted in laughter. Even the defendant, a stocky man with a tired expression, looked at her in disbelief. Judge Hayes arched an eyebrow, a cynical smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Is this some kind of joke? Where are your parents, little girl?" The general laughter grew louder, but the young woman remained unmoved. "My name is Helena Carter, and I am your assigned attorney." The laughter died down. An awkward silence filled the room. Who was this girl? And more importantly, how did she have the audacity to face the most feared judge in town with such confidence? What no one knew was that Helena Carter was about to shock everyone with a brilliant move. Judge Alexander Hayes leaned forward, watching the girl with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. The silence in the courtroom was almost palpable. "You expect me to take this seriously?" he said, adjusting his glasses. "Let's start with the basics. Where did you go to school?" "Oh, forget it. You haven't even finished high school yet." More laughter filled the room. One of the attorneys in the back shook his head, muttering something about how the courtroom had become a circus. The defendant himself, Lucas Monroe, seemed unsure whether he should trust this young attorney or simply accept his sentence. But Helena Carter was unfazed. She kept her gaze fixed on the judge and, in a firm, unhesitating tone, answered, "With all due respect, Your Honor, the Constitution does not set an age limit for arguing a case in court. I am qualified to be here, and if you give me the chance, I promise I can prove my client's innocence." The murmurs died down. The conviction in her voice began to silence even the most skeptical. Judge Hayes stared at her for a moment, as if debating whether he should simply throw her out or whether it was worth watching the spectacle that was undoubtedly about to unfold. He slammed his gavel down on the table. "All right, Miss Carter, I will allow you to proceed, but only because this will be an object lesson in how people should prepare themselves before entering my chambers." A few muffled chuckles echoed. The tone of contempt in the judge's voice was evident, but Helena simply nodded, showing no sign of nervousness. With a precise movement, she opened her leather briefcase, took out a sealed envelope, and handed it to the judge's assistant. "Before we begin, Your Honor, I would like to present this document to the court. It is a motion to dismiss the prosecution's main evidence." Hayes's expression changed slightly. He raised his eyebrows, now with a glimmer of curiosity. "This should be interesting. Continue." The room fell into absolute silence. No one had expected this young woman to go beyond her initial provocation. But now everyone was about to discover that Helena Carter was not here to play. She was here to win. Judge Alexander Hayes crossed his arms, regarding Helena Carter with a critical eye. His patience seemed to be at its limit, and the slight irony in his tone made it clear that he still did not take the girl seriously. "So, Miss Carter, do you want me to dismiss the prosecution's main evidence? And what exactly would be your justification for this?" The lawyers in the courtroom exchanged glances, some smiling, others clearly waiting to see how this scene would go. The prosecution, led by the experienced Daniel Foster, seemed calm. For him, this hearing was already won, but Helena was not. Intimidated. She adjusted her glasses, stood up straight, and answered firmly, "The prosecution bases its entire accusation on a video recording that supposedly shows my client robbing a warehouse on the night of June 15th. However, after reviewing the video, I noticed something peculiar." Foster, who until then had maintained a calm expression, frowned. "I request permission to play the video in court." The judge hesitated for a moment. He could simply reject that request. But something about the girl's confidence made him reconsider. "Do it quickly, Miss Carter." The room fell silent as the video began to be displayed on the main screen. In it, a tall figure wearing a black sweatshirt was seen breaking down the door of a warehouse and entering. The video had no audio, but it seemed to clearly incriminate Lucas Monroe, Helena's client. Foster smiled, already anticipating her victory. "As you can see, Your Honor," Helena began, suddenly pausing the video. "The person in the video appears to be committing a crime, but there is something the prosecution has not noticed. I ask that everyone pay attention to the reflection in the window, on the right side of the screen." The prosecution exchanged glances. What was she insinuating? Helena enlarged the image of the reflection. The room fell into absolute silence. In the window glass, a digital clock on the dashboard of a car parked outside was reflected. And what caught everyone's attention? The time it displayed. "The clock reads 10:13 p.m., Helena said, turning to the judge. However, the prosecution claimed that the crime occurred at 11:45 p.m. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Hayes leaned forward, frowning. "That suggests," he began, but Helena didn't wait. "That proves that the video was manipulated, Your Honor. And if the main evidence against my client was tampered with, then this entire case falls apart." Foster's face went rigid. He stood up immediately. "This is a cheap trick, Your Honor, a desperate attempt to divert attention from the facts." But Helena didn't back down. She stepped forward and, with a sharp look, declared, "If it is a trick, then the prosecution will have no problem presenting a technical expert's report to prove the authenticity of the video. Otherwise, we have the right to request that this evidence be completely disregarded." Judge Hayes adjusted his glasses and glanced at Foster, who remained silent. The weight of that revelation was beginning to sink in. The judge's gavel echoed through the room. "I will adjourn the court for 20 minutes while I consider the motion. No one will leave." The courtroom was in suspense. What was supposed to be a simple hearing had become a strategic game. Helena Carter had just planted the seed of doubt, but what no one knew was that she still had more tricks up her sleeve. The minutes the court was adjourned seemed like an eternity. Murmurs echoed through the room. Lawyers exchanged puzzled glances, and the prosecution whispered in tense tones. Judge Alexander Hayes returned to his chair, his eyes scanning the papers in front of him before banging his gavel and restoring order. "After reviewing the motion and the evidence presented by the defense, I must admit that there is merit to the argument." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The recording will be temporarily disregarded until its authenticity is confirmed. Miss Carter, you have my attention. Continue." The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Helena Carter had done what seemed impossible, dismantled the key piece of the accusation. But she didn't stop there. She took another document from her folder and looked directly at the prosecution's attorney, Daniel Foster, who now seemed less confident. "Now, Your Honor, I will present something that explains why my client is being wrongly accused." The murmurs returned, this time filled with curiosity and tension. Helena took a deep breath and continued. "During my investigation, I discovered that the warehouse in question belongs to a conglomerate called Eastman Logistics. Interestingly, the director of security for this company is the same man who presented the edited recording, Mr. Jonathan Harper." The name reverberated through the courtroom. Some spectators exchanged confused glances. Others were already beginning to understand where Helena was coming from. Jonathan Harper himself, who was sitting among the witnesses, adjusted his suit and cleared his throat uncomfortably. Helena turned to the audience, her gaze still fixed on her. I have discovered that Mr. Harper is facing internal charges of financial mismanagement. He has embezzled thousands of dollars from the company and needed a scapegoat to justify the disappearance of assets from the warehouse. This is absurd, Foster's voice boomed through the room, trying to cut through the impact of the revelation. This young lady is trying to tarnish the reputation of a respectable man without any concrete evidence. But Helena did not back down. Respectable? We will see how the court evaluates this after I present this financial report. She handed a document to the judge's assistant and projected another copy onto a screen for everyone to see. Here is a record of Harper's bank transfers to an offshore account. These deposits were made shortly after the alleged theft. The room was filled with a frenzy of murmurs. The impact was palpable. Judge Hayes frowned and leaned forward in his chair. Mr. Harper, what do you have to say about that? Harper cleared his throat, his face beginning to sweat. This is a coincidence. But Helena didn't let up. A coincidence? Because I also have emails exchanged between Harper and a video editor, discussing adjustments to the footage that was presented as evidence against my client. The courtroom erupted into louder murmurs. The judge himself had to bang his gavel to restore order. Harper looked pale. Foster crossed his arms, furious. But what no one noticed was that Helena Carter had not yet delivered her final blow. She had only just begun to dismantle the prosecution's house of cards. The silence that filled the courtroom was almost suffocating. All eyes were fixed on Jonathan Harper, whose expression now wavered between nervousness and despair. He opened his mouth as if to defend himself, but no words came out. Judge Alexander Hayes leaned forward, his fingers drumming lightly on the wood of his desk. Mr. Harper, Miss Carter has just presented some very serious evidence against you. Do you have anything to say in your defense? The man cleared his throat, straightened his suit, and tried to regain his composure. This is a setup, he said, his voice louder than necessary. A young woman with no experience whatsoever is trying to tarnish my reputation with unfounded accusations. But Helena Carter remained undeterred. She didn't blink. If my accusations were unfounded, Mr. Harper, then why is the video editor who manipulated the footage willing to testify against you? The air in the courtroom seemed to grow heavier. Harper tensed visibly, his eyes avoiding direct contact with anyone in the room. Helena pulled a new document from her briefcase and held it up. Here is the signed statement from this technician, confirming that he was given direct orders by Mr. Harper to modify the video and incriminate my client. The prosecution looked panicked. Foster stood, his posture rigid, but said nothing. For once, he had no ready argument. Judge Hayes watched the scene, his eyes assessing Harper like a predator assessing its prey. Mr. Harper, I ask again, do you have anything to say about these charges? The silence that followed lasted only few seconds, but it felt like hours. Harper took a deep breath. He looked around as if searching for an invisible exit and finally stammered, I. His face was flushed, his breathing quickened. Then he broke down. Okay. Did it? The confession echoed through the courtroom. A collective shock rippled through the room. Nervous murmurs broke out among the lawyers and spectators. The judge banged his gavel loudly. Silence in the courtroom. Helena stood still, watching Harper sink into his own confession. So, you're confirming that you manipulated the evidence to incriminate Lucas Monroe? She pressed. Harper hung his head in defeat. Yes, I did. The murmurs grew louder, and the judge had to bang his gavel once more. Mr. Harper, in light of your confession, you will be arrested immediately. On suspicion of procedural fraud and tampering with evidence, officers take him into custody. 2 guards approached, and without resistance, Harper was escorted from the courtroom. But Helena knew that even though she had accomplished the impossible by unmasking the real culprit, The case was not yet closed. Her client, Lucas Monroe, was still sitting in the dock, and the prosecution was not about to give up so easily. Jonathan Harper's confession still hung in the courtroom like an electric shock. The man had been taken into custody, but the case was not closed. Lucas Monroe, the defendant, remained seated in the dock, and Prosecutor Daniel Foster was not about to back down without a fight. He stood up quickly, his voice firm as he tried to regain control of the situation. Your Honor, despite Mr. Harper's confession, we still have reason to believe that Lucas Monroe was involved in the crime. After all, he has a criminal record and was seen near the warehouse on the night of the incident. The tension in the courtroom increased. Some jurors nodded, showing that the prosecution's strategy could still have an effect. But Helena Carter had already expected this move. She calmly closed her briefcase, stepped forward, and looked directly at Judge Alexander Hayes. Your Honor, the prosecution is trying to base its accusations solely on my client's geographic proximity, completely ignoring the facts already presented. She paused strategically, letting her words echo around the room. But to eliminate any doubt, I will prove that Lucas Monroe could not have committed this crime. The judge crossed his arms. Do you have any other tricks up your sleeve, Miss Carter? A faint smile tugged at the corners of Helena's lips. Without answering directly, she opened her briefcase again and pulled out 2 documents. Here is a record of the text messages sent and received on Lucas Monroe's phone on the night of the alleged robbery. She walked over to the judge's assistant and handed him the papers before projecting a copy onto the screen. The image showed a screenshot of the messages. It was a conversation between Lucas and his young daughter. Helena pointed to the times. At 11:45 p.m., exactly when the prosecution claims the crime was taking place, my client was texting his daughter. The impact was immediate. The judge took the documents and read the messages in silence. The room grew even more attentive, but Helena wasn't done yet. And there's more, Your Honor. My client wasn't just on the phone. He was in a public cafe using the local Wi-Fi to talk to his daughter. That cafe is 5 miles from the warehouse, which makes it impossible for him to have been at the crime scene. The murmurs resumed. Foster's face hardened. The judge leaned forward in his chair. And you have any proof of that? Helena Carter nodded and picked up another document. Yes, Your Honor. This is the security camera footage from the cafe, which shows Lucas Monroe entering at 11:20 p.m. and leaving after 1 a.m., well after the time of the crime. She projected the video onto the screen. There was Lucas ordering a coffee and sitting down with his phone in his hand, texting. The courtroom fell silent. There was no more doubt. The prosecution was completely defeated. Foster ran his hand over his face in frustration. He knew there was no more evidence to support the prosecution. Helena crossed her arms and waited. Now, it was up to Judge Alexander Hayes to make his decision. Judge Alexander Hayes watched the screen intently. The image of Lucas Monroe sitting in the cafe, typing messages on his phone, was irrefutable evidence. But he didn't rush. He adjusted his glasses, reviewed the documents once more, and looked up at the prosecution. Given this evidence, does the prosecution still wish to proceed with the prosecution? The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Daniel Foster, the prosecutor, clenched his fists. His expression made it clear that he already knew the answer, but he didn't want to admit defeat. He stood up slowly, looked at his team, then at the judge, and finally at Helena Carter. Your Honor, the prosecution has no more arguments to support. The prosecution. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. It was the end. The case had completely collapsed. Judge Hayes banged his gavel firmly, restoring order. He took a deep breath before declaring, his voice grave and imposing. After reviewing all the evidence presented, it is clear that the defendant, Lucas Monroe, was not present at the scene of the crime and had no involvement in the incident. He paused, looking directly at the defendant. This court finds Lucas Monroe not guilty of all charges. The reaction was immediate. Some present breathed a sigh of relief, others applauded quietly, while Lucas Monroe covered his face with his hands holding back tears. He looked at Helena Carter with genuine gratitude. She, in turn, smiled quietly and leaned in to whisper, "I told you I believed you." Foster gathered up his papers, visibly defeated. The case that had seemed like a surefire victory for the prosecution had turned into an absolute disaster. But while the courtroom was still absorbing the events, Judge Hayes looked directly at Helena. There was something else he wanted to know, and he wouldn't let her leave without answering. The courtroom was slowly beginning to empty, but the tension still hung in the air. Murmurs of admiration filled the room as Lucas Monroe embraced his newfound freedom. But before Helena Carter could leave, the firm voice of Judge Alexander Hayes stopped her. "Miss Carter." She stopped, turned slowly, and met the judge's analytical gaze. He adjusted his glasses once more, his gaze filled with something different now. There was no longer irony or disbelief. There was curiosity. "I can't deny that you've accomplished something extraordinary here today. But there's something that still intrigues me." Helena stood still, waiting. "How did you, at such a young age, achieve this level of preparation and confidence? You still haven't told us your true story." The courtroom fell silent once. A few people who were already standing waiting to leave turned around, interested. Helena hesitated, but only for a moment. She adjusted her worn leather briefcase and with a small smile replied, "Your Honor, I learned from the best." The judge arched an eyebrow, waiting for more. Helena took a deep breath. "My father was one of the most brilliant lawyers in this country. Before he passed away, he taught me something fundamental, that justice is not about age, status, or power. It is about courage. It is about truth." The silence in the room grew profound. "I only did what he taught me to do." Judge Hayes studied her for a few seconds. Finally, a rare smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "If this is what the future of the legal profession holds for us, then I would say we are in good hands." He paused, crossing his arms. "But next time, Miss Carter, you might want to mention your credentials before you step into my courtroom." Helena smiled back. "You would ruin the surprise, Your Honor." "Never." The murmurs of admiration filled the room again as she walked toward the exit. And that day, everyone who witnessed that trial understood one thing. They would never underestimate Helena Carter again.